Armchair History TV is the newest place to find your favorite history content creators. It's ad-free, unlike this, unfiltered, with an extensive library of over 150 videos and counting, with an exclusive podcast and Discord community to help you keep up with all the action. Use code HISTORYLAND for 50% off your subscription.
Right. Well, Washington at least, did know what he had done wrong, although he failed to, grasp the intensity of the extent of his fault. So on 30th May, his project isn't over yet because he needs to drive out the French and build a new fort. So he begins to, build a new fort on 30th May, and this is in fear that should the French reach the site, we might be attacked by their considerable forces. I began to raise a fort with a little palisade. So he still has this idea of 1,600 French troops in mind, right? And this fort is to become the famous Fort Necessity, which would be the site of another defeat. And I'm not sure if this, if could have averted the next incident at the Fort Necessity, but on the 31st May, Joshua Fry, the commander-in-chief of the Virginia Regiment, dies on his way of bringing reinforcements from Winchester, which was like their nearest supply base for arms and manpower. And Washington is informed that he is promoted to lieutenant colonel under the service of Colonel James Innes, who will command the entire colonial army. So Washington suddenly is left with even bigger responsibility to complete the fort, which is done on 3rd June. The short interval of which indicates how hastily it had been done, as well as taking command of all the army, which is now amassed because the private companies of South Carolina under James McKay has arrived. But they are quite unruly because they don't consider themselves as a part of Washington's command. They consider themselves very independent. And so is the commissioner named Muse. They both of them failed to cooperate with Washington in bringing out the necessary supplies, administering the flow of them from Winchester to Fort Necessity and the entire Great Meadows. Washington, again, is very frustrated with the presence of them, which is, destroying the morale at his camp, etc. But anyways, Washington officially receives his promotion on 10th June 1754. And he now pledges to, resume his effort to unite the Six Nations against the French. And the Half King at this point still appears to be very thankful about Washington's, efforts for rapprochements. And Washington even, returns the Half King's favor by christening Queen Aliquipa's son, Dinwiddie. Dinwiddie. Yeah.
It's not a name that you would choose today for certain, but that kid might be in for a bit of a rough time at school.
So Washington at this time still believes that despite his recalcitrant officers, the Indians' allies would not betray him. Okay? But on 21st June 1754, he is devastated to hear from the Half King and the Delawares, whom he suspected was part of the French agents from Montreal, that they won't join him for the next expedition. Okay? So Washington again finds himself isolated. Now, why is the Half King suddenly changing his attitude? I think it can be, inferred from his later remarks on Washington, I think. So he says, Washington is a good-natured man, but without experience, who refused to take advice from the Indians. In particular, he lay at Great Meadows from one full moon to the other and made no fortification at all, but that little thing upon the meadows, meaning that Fort Necessity, which even he could not call a fort because it was so scantily organized. He does not, even want to make his stand there, and begins to contemplate making a stand at the nearby plantation of Gist instead. And meanwhile, on 26th June 1754, Villiers, Le Grand Villiers, as he was called by his Canadian colleagues, arrived at Fort Duquesne, and he is shocked to hear this from Contrecoeur there. So Contrecoeur delivers him the news of the death of his brother at the hands of the British. So Villiers was his half-brother, just like Washington and Lawrence. He was, I believe, 8 years older than Ensign Jumonville. And on the 26th, he begins to set up a council of war to rally his Indian allies. And on 28th June, he manages to gather 500 French-Canadian troops de la Marine and 300 Indian allies, leaving Fort Duquesne at 10 a.m. And he received an order from Contrecoeur, which had two dimensions that echoed Dinwiddie's and the earlier one given to Jumonville. On the one hand was the punitive nature of this expedition to chastise the enemy for the murder they had committed on us in violation of the most sacred laws of the civilized nations, and to publicize the infamous assassination perpetrated. And that should the enemy hide themselves to avoid a battle, he would ravage their cattle and attempt to fall on some of their convoys to defeat them entirely. On the other hand, they were to shun cruelty as far as they can, because it would be forbidden to regard the English as enemies in the future under the mandate from their king, and that they ought to be very much concerned if forced into a war with the English, because the French were extremely worried about any battle being prolonged with the English, because they were also very aware of their shortage of population compared to the English. They knew that the English would build 2 forts when they were building 1 and populate them really quickly. And on the same day, in the evening, Washington finally, as I said, reassembles his entire army at Gist's plantation, where he hears the news that in 2 days, 1,200 French and Indians are going to march against us. That was a slight overestimation of the enemy capabilities, but it doesn't change the fact that Washington is at a corner right now. He is still outnumbered. And he discusses with his officers, McKay, Gist, and others, to fortify here, to keep fortifying here and make a stand here, or go to Fort Necessity and make a stand there. And it was decided that it was absolutely necessary to go back, because if we're here, the enemy could start a war of attrition by cutting us off from the fort. And not to mention that this terrain was very advantageous to the invaders, for the nearby defiles could offer a very secure cushions for the invaders to enter unnoticed. Whereas that Fort Necessity was situated on this vast meadows, the Great Meadows. It was a very open ground that could expose any enemy approaching from far away. But the problem was that Washington was going to eat up the little time he had by commencing this retrograde march all the way to Fort Necessity. And on the 1st of July, he's back. But the extreme rain and the exhaustion of his troops, who had not had any bread or meat for the previous 8 days, compel him to call it quits here and let the troops rest. But by this time, Villiers had advanced as far as the Redstone Creek. So you can see why the Half King had chosen to abandon Washington, basically. It was his decision for the sake of his own survival. I mean, if he sides with a weaker party, then he would become estranged by both the British and the French, and as well as the neighboring tribes, right?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. It's a sensible course of action.
mhm,
Washington has his reasons for staying based on his supplies and things like that. Maybe he thinks he can't get them out
right.
in time or something. But Half King makes the very sensible decision that this is not a defensible position, and there's too many French and Indians coming at us. We have to get out. And also, that is the way that war is fought in the wilderness. To be honest, it's the law that there's no shame in retreating,
Mhm,
basically, to avoid the fight where you don't want to fight is
right.
it always annoyed Europeans who didn't understand how um, Native Americans fought, or how they, because they had very small populations. You can't just throw lives away just for the sake of ground. You
Yeah.
have to choose wisely where you fight, and when you start taking casualties, you have to pull out. So yes, I think Half King did made the right call here.
Right. The so-called Indian mode you're referring to, by the way, the
Yeah.
colonists gradually got accustomed to it. And I believe that these warfares were conceptualized as irregular warfare
Yeah.
in the 18th century British pamphlets, where they discussed it with the reference to the Jacobite Rising, yeah,
Mhm.
where such similar forms of warfare took place. So I would say that the Europeans were at this point not completely strange to this idea. And I would like to make a comeback to this later when I discuss the Braddock expedition, where the commander really gets a bad reputation for his supposed ignorance of this tactic.
Yes, absolutely. The
Yeah.
French called it petit guerre. They were
Mhm.
aware of how to fight irregular warfare. They were aware of its existence.
Yeah.
Um, and yes, the Jacobites would count in that, because although the Jacobites didn't disperse to fight, they charged with their swords,
Mhm.
to fight hand to hand in a much older style. It's more a question of, some people like Washington, for instance, would get annoyed when war bands who are with them would just suddenly decide to go away, and they would tend
Yeah.
to, blame them for being cowards and things like that. Whereas in reality, it was just a fairly sensible way of fighting. But we will get to this. We will get to
Yeah.
European attitudes to wilderness fighting after we find out what happens to George Washington.
All right. So on the 3rd of July at daybreak, Villiers began to approach the site of his brother's assassination. And he realizes that this is the place. The weather was like extremely rainy, but he could identify the remnants of the dead French soldiers, the uniforms, all the debris. And he would later come back to the site to bury his brother formally. And they're all like drenched in rain. Both Washington's men, waiting for something in at Fort Necessary, and the French and the Indians coming by the Redstone Creek and the Monongahela. And it's very early in the morning when about 9 a.m. I think, that when Adam Stephen and George Washington get the intelligence that the French had left the Monongahela, and that a scout had been shot on the way, which suggested that the enemy was now on their heels, right in front of them. And to compare their forces once more, the British had, according to Washington, 284 men fit for service and 7 Indian scouts versus 600 French Canadian and 100 Indians, whom they overestimated to be between 1,200 to 1,600 men. So imagine the impact that would have had on their morale, right?
Yeah, not good at all. Not good at all. And that's an interesting factor as well in a lot of fighting in the bush, in the wilderness, is that the both sides would often exaggerate the numbers of the other side, and this will happen on the Monongahela as well,
Right.
where actually the British will think they're being attacked by many more
Mhm.
enemies than they are. In this case, Washington's actually correct. He is
Mhm.
outnumbered.
Okay. Which does not influence the outcome of the battle, unfortunately for him. So he realizes that even this plan of making a stand in front of the fort needs to be abandoned because there's no way they could stand the chance against them. He instead orders his men to, withdraw to the trenches by fortifying them further. So it really is a last-minute preparation. And then the first firing starts at 11 a.m. From the woods, and Washington's men again have no choice but to withdraw to the trenches and like fire at the almost like invisible enemy, according to Washington, who were firing behind the trees, who never came to the open ground. And the most frightened here was the South Carolina Independent Company because it was located at the flank and was greatly exposed to the French fire. So I think they must have really resented Washington by this time, since they were like, they had always been quite wary of his inexperience, I would say. But there is also another account by Adam Stephen saying that Washington sternly ordered his men to keep firing, which was done with great alacrity and undauntedness, according to Washington himself. But nothing really changed the outcome of the battle because it turned out that they must seek shelter or perish in front of the trenches. So at 6 p.m. In the evening, Washington makes his final effort to rally the men, while they are like firing with the water from the muddy water up to their neck because of the flood that has lasted for days. And Washington now, it dawns on him that they have no, chance whatsoever. It's all over, really. Washington records this moment, saying, "We continued this unequal fight with an enemy sheltered behind the trees, ourselves without shelter, in trenches full of water in a settled rain, and the enemy galling us on all sides incessantly from the woods." But Villiers also has has the reason to stop, call it a stop, because the Indians were going to leave on the next day. That was just in their itinerary, and they were firing so enthusiastically that they were almost running out of their ammunition,
Mhm.
no ammo. So at 8 p.m., the attack kind of subsides with the darkness, and Villiers sent in an ensign named Le Mercier, who solicits Washington to accept their flag of truce and sign this document of capitulation. Washington initially refuses. He thinks it's some ploy to trap them into some worse situation. But after discussing all together, they feel like this is the only thing they can do in this dire situation. And Washington, assigns his adjutant Peroni, if you remember, the only officer whom
Mhm.
he had who could speak French fluently and had been promoted to his aide de camp, and that Van Bram, his Dutch swordmaster. These two are assigned to go to Villiers' camp to parley with him and discuss their terms of capitulation. But the problem was Peroni had been wounded during the skirmish, and he is basically he's unable to function properly here. So Van Bram virtually becomes the only available negotiator here. And when Le Mercier and Villiers hand him the terms of capitulation, Van Bram he reads them and lets Villiers explain each of the terms. So the point 1 to 7, I think, it's very conventional terms of surrender, that they retreat peacefully to their own land, surrender their ammunitions while taking their personal belongings. They will be guaranteed escort as they withdraw. But then the last clause, the sixth clause, it turned out to be very problematic because it read it would demand an exchange of prisoners, you know, in response to the assassination of Sire de Jumonville on the previous day. And these prisoners would be Bram himself and Robert Stobo, a Scotsman in the Virginia Regiment. Now, Bram returns to Fort Necessity at 10 p.m. and explains these terms to Washington, except for the last one. He kind of obviates the last clause now, to which some historians attribute his deliberate attempt to speed up the negotiation so as to just call an end to this horrible situation. Basically, what he tells Washington is minus that of the clause involving the admission of the assassination of Sire de Jumonville. And Washington unwittingly signs this and hands over his terms of surrender to Jumonville by Van Bram. And Bram and Stobo are taken prisoners the next day in exchange for the French prisoners quartered at Williamsburg. And it's only several weeks later that Washington, or the authorities responsible for commissioning Washington, finds out what had actually happened. So on 11th July, Washington returns to Colonel Inez at Winchester and hands him the document in French that he signed. And he hits the ceiling, obviously, but Inez doesn't blame him. He blames the audacity of the French, saying the French inherently are a people that never pay any regard to treaties longer than they find them consistent with their interest. This, in fact, has the impact of increasing the alarm of the French offensive in North America, that Dinwiddie, from now on, constantly brings this up to the House of Burgesses and rallies for using it to rally for intercolonial efforts to fight the French. But in between, the next campaign and this one is the failed plan of union at Albany. It was initially, proposed by Franklin in 1741, and even back then it had been, rejected because it was too radical. It was too all-encompassing, as if to limit the autonomy of each colony. And then, like on June 1754, in the Albany Council of 7 delegates from each state, Franklin brings this up again, a scheme for uniting the northern colonies by effecting a parliamentary union with a governor general appointed by the king, who would administer and garner annual budget for defense, to be drawn from liquor taxes, and to stage regular meetings to discuss Indian affairs. These plans become rejected again. And this results in the lackadaisical support, intercolonial support for the next war effort, which is Washington's campaign with General Edward Braddock, who is newly assigned as the commander-in-chief of the entire colony. But Washington, too, isn't really enthusiastic about this mission. In fact, before even Braddock becomes commissioned as the commander, Washington hands in his first resignation around October 1754. His motives were first lack of acknowledgement, especially lack of compensations in financial, and lack of financial compensation, I would say. He is already sick and tired of being underpaid, mistreated, and undersupplied by his fellow colonial officers. And he also complains about the lack of, unity in the independent companies he is to control. So when he is offered a position of captain in the upcoming expedition, he declines and says, even says in a quite cheeky manner, "The idea has filled me with surprise. If you think me capable of holding a commission that has neither rank nor honor annexed to it, you must entertain a very contemptible opinion of my weakness and believe me to be more empty than the commission itself. So in some, why be a captain and be even more underfunded when the cause of the lack of compensation is lack of support for the expedition in general and lack of trust placed in himself. But Washington decides to join the army upon solicitation from Braddock's aide-de-camp named Robert Orme, who's a former lieutenant in the Coldstream Guards. He writes to Washington on 2nd March 1755 that the new commander thinks very highly of Washington's conduct, that he wants to recommend him to join this army. But Washington now opts to join as an unpaid civilian ADC camp to the British ADC to the British Army, which I think is a very perplexing choice. He complains about being underpaid, but he now chooses to be an unpaid ADC. And he says yes formally on 15th March. And he explains his motives for accepting the role this time. Says he was initially, unwilling to accept this either, but says, but besides this and the laudable desire I may have to serve my king and country, I must be ingenuous enough to confess that I am not a little biased by selfish considerations to attain some knowledge on the military profession under a gentleman of Braddock's abilities and experience. In short, he wishes to become a small fish in a big pond at the expense of financial compensation, probably because of his exposure to inept or often uncooperative colonial officials. He wants to experience the taste of a real British army, and he
wants to sort of have an apprenticeship, but without any responsibility.
Right. So he has some responsibilities, which often involved acting as a sort of intermediary between the colonial officials and Braddock, mostly to deal with the supply chain. Again, this problem is a permanent one throughout his campaign, because Braddock really begs the colonists to gather this war fund in order to launch a large-scale offensive on Canada as a whole, but the colonies decline, and Braddock is surprised that they're lacking in the most necessary supplies, such as wagons and bateaux, which are a must for traveling into the Western hinterlands.
This is very much sort of the role of an aide-de-camp. You take charge of things, you make sure that they get done, but it means that I think it might also to Washington have seemed like a more, I don't know, purposeful use of his time, because if he's technically a colonel or had been a colonel and you're being paid as a captain and you're not being really supported, then there's no point in doing that. But if you change the role, then at least the purpose is more honorable, I guess, perhaps.
Right.
So he's quite happy to be an ADC to Braddock for this expedition, which is now, I believe, and Braddock. I think Braddock probably wants him just simply as the letter said. Washington was the guy out there. He knows the terrain. He knows certain things about it. He knows how to get there. So he would be a useful guy for Braddock to want around.
And Washington becomes, really content with his service under Braddock because he feels like Braddock has treated him with esteem and kindly invited me into his family, meaning his army, despite utmost confusion and disorder prevailing in the assembly, which was, experiencing a strain during their conference with Braddock. So what exactly happened was on 14th April 1755, an intercolonial conference is summoned at Alexandria under Braddock's design. And Washington is not present at this, although many narratives cite Washington as having partaken in this. That's not correct, most likely. And Braddock announces his grand strategy here that he will take Fort Duquesne by late June to early July, and then he will then launch a simultaneous amphibious offensive on Crown Point and Niagara, so as to cut off the French line of communication completely by taking control of the entire Niagara line, to sever the hinterlands from the Trois-Rivières area. And he, for this, he exhorts the ministers to raise a war fund by drawing up a specific decree to ensure a permanent pipeline to make this fund. But the governors are kind of, the governors kind of feel like this is too much, because they say no fund cannot be established without the aid of Parliament. And they rather counter-propose that the king's ministers should find some method of compelling the individual colonists rather instead. Meanwhile, Morris, representing Pennsylvania, says, while he himself gets the point, he thinks it would be repugnant to the non-resisting principles, the pacifist principles of the Quakers in Pennsylvania. So there are, very contested interests in this assembly. But Braddock does manage to, ensure the efforts made to rally the Native Americans in the expedition. Unlike the popular misconception that he completely ignored his Indian allies, he conferred extensively with the colonists about this subject, and even emphasizes the necessity of maintaining the ties of the Native Americans. The problem was Dinwiddie made a guarantee that about 300 to 400 Native Americans will join him around Fort Cumberland, but only like 8 of them manages to arrive. So both Braddock and Washington, on top of this extensive supply problem, as well as the lack of discipline, especially among the colonial conscripts, and in general, the lack of cooperation by the colonial officials, both of them share their resentment against the whole system of administration. So Washington really sympathizes with Braddock in this regard.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. A lot of problems with this expedition. Obviously, those of you watching will know already it doesn't end well, and some of that is to do with the great problems in getting troops that many troops that far into the hinterland, and some of it is just due to bad luck, and some of it is due to the skill of the enemy. So
yeah,
if you can, so the expedition goes to the Monongahela to try and take Fort Duquesne, as Braddock laid out. What are some common misconceptions of this battle, and what did Washington do there?
Oh, there are many of them. First of all, the fact that Braddock did not send in any flying squadrons and relied on this obstinate line infantry, the European-style line infantry. In fact, Washington privately advised him to send an advanced column of about half their force ahead, while discarding the artillery that are too unwieldy, which Braddock consistently follows. He first sends an advanced column under Colonel Dunbar, to spearhead the whole column, while throwing out some of the baggages, the sick and the wounded, and many female camp followers by sending them back to Fort Cumberland. And they continued to reconnoiter toward the road in two streams. The stream from the Redstone Creek to Monongahela, they consistently scout in two columns, and always occupying the most advantageous ground, the high grounds where the Indians could exploit. So yeah, Braddock did not neglect that, and it was in part due to thanks to Washington's advice. The second misconception is that Braddock was unwilling to listen to anybody, including Washington. Well, that's a common accusation by the contemporary colonists like Benjamin Franklin, who accused Braddock of completely ignoring the advice to, pay attention to the Indian attack. But Braddock, although he was a bit obstinate by nature, was clearly willing to, incorporate the colonial style of warfare. It's evident in that he mentioned the importance of maintaining alliances with Indians during his conference at Alexandria, although they did not mostly arrive, and that's Dinwiddie's fault, I think, not Braddock's, right? And that Braddock detested the colonists, or were like unwilling to cooperate with them. Now this we need to always listen to both sides, because according to Washington and Orm from Braddock's headquarters, the colonists were often prone to misbehavior, such as excessive consumption of liquor and disobedience to discipline, which even led to, Lieutenant Gage publicly, punishing a one of such dissidents by subjecting him to, I think, hundreds of lashes in public. And then there's the misconception that it was a unilateral ambush by the French. The truth is, when Braddock finished the crossing of the Monongahela on 3 p.m., it's unsure which side had fired first. In fact, the French were likely to have been just as surprised, because unlike the Fort Necessity, they were the French were the ones who were very outnumbered. The British had about 2,100 men, and the French about less than half. And its commander, Daniel Leonard de Beaujeu, had to basically dress in Indian attire to rally their wavering brothers to raise their hatchets against them. So yeah, it was not a carefully crafted ambush by the French. And that Washington was, an active participant in the battle. Although, he claims in his letter to Dinwiddie that in the later phase, he tried to, reinstill the morale of the troops. He technically was in a non-fighting position. He was a unpaid civilian ADC. And lastly, this is somewhere between misconception and debate. So which side was more at wrong after the battle started, the British or the colonists? So Washington claims that it was because of the dastardly behavior of the British that the battle went astray, that as soon as they came under the Indians and the Frenchmen's volleys, they went everywhere, and they refused to listen to those at the rear to hold their lines. But these claims mostly come from the colonists' sources that I would conclude it was carefully planned, but due to the initial confusion reigning in the front columns, some of the columns staggered, but it was not necessarily because one side was more indisciplined than another, I would say. And this expedition is ruined again as well. Washington receives 4 bullets, which penetrates his coat, but he does not receive any wound. Instead, both commanders, Leonard de Beaujeu and Braddock, are mortally wounded. Beaujeu killed on the spot, and Braddock dying 3 days later.
Yeah, this is a massive shock to everybody. This defeat
Mhm.
by the British, and that was a great summary of a lot of the myths about it, because there are a lot of myths about this battle, because it is actually
Mhm.
quite such a surprise to everybody. Everybody has to figure
Mhm.
out what went wrong. Um, Irene, this has been a really great video to film. We've
Thank
covered
you.
a lot of ground, and you've done it in superb detail. I'm so pleased that you were able to come on the show to talk to us about the beginning of the 7 Years' War today.
I hope you enjoyed it. I mean, it's already what, 2 hours, I think, since the show started.
Something like that. We might be able
Yeah.
to turn it into a series of videos, possibly. We'll
Yeah.
see how it goes. It might
All right.
it might divide quite well, actually, because
Mhm.
there's sort of good junction points.
Mhm.
But we have run out of time, alas, dear viewers.
Mhm.
So from myself here at Historyland and Irene Kim in Seoul, Korea, we would like to thank you for watching and encourage you to come back and like and subscribe. Please go and follow Irene on Twitter. I'll have all her details in the description box. Thank you for watching. Have a great day, night, whatever, and I'll see you again for another adventure in Historyland the next time. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for watching that video, guys. Please like and subscribe on the way out. And remember, you can use my exclusive code HISTORYLAND for 50% off your subscription at Armchair History TV, where I will be making exclusive content for everybody who is signed up. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you again for another adventure in Historyland the next time.